Ladies and gentlemen, once again, I have another tremendous guest, somebody I have great affection for this, the 400th episode of Robservations, Miss Melinda Snodgrass, who is an author, a producer, a novelist and television writer. She's been a story editor and a writer on Star Trek The Next Generation, and now let me get this straight. If I get this wrong, tell me. But you have written episodes of Odyssey 5, The Outer Limits, Sequest, Reasonable Doubts. You were a consulting producer on The Profiler. You were once a lawyer. And you have a number of different series that you've written, including the Circuit series, the Edge series, the Imperial Saga, and you even have written under a pen name of Philippa Bornikova, where you have written legal thrillers.
Yeah, well, they're actually sort of an urban fantasy. It's a young woman lawyer working in a vampire law firm in Manhattan.
I'm in. I haven't read these, but I'm now reading them.
Well, hang on, because I got the rights back to the series, and we're putting them out under my own name now rather than using the pseudonym. And the first book is probably going to go up in the next couple of weeks. So we hired a fabulous young cover artist to do new covers for the books. So yeah, I'm sort of, playing with, I keep one foot in traditional publishing. I'm trying this whole indie pub thing, and then I have the Hollywood stuff too. And on the lawyer front, I got better. I'm a recovered lawyer. So, but it did, define my career in a lot of ways.
Well, I first encountered you. I mean, it's no secret to anybody that watches my show. I'm a fanatical Star Trek fan. I have been since I was a little kid. And I have every Star Trek novel ever published. And I think one of the great things that happened in my life was in the wake of Star Trek The Motion Picture, which was at the time the greatest thing that happened in my life, was that Pocket Books they took over the novel series, and the first novel they released was Vonda McIntyre's The Entropy Effect, after they'd released the novelization for Star Trek The Motion Picture, and they began publishing Star Trek novels.
Yep.
And the thing about the Star Trek novels is I did not consider them not canon, because it was obvious to me that everybody that was writing Star Trek novels was not only such a great fan of the show, but they spent so much time world building. And then your novel came along in I think it was 1984 it was published, The Tears of the Singers, and you chose to focus on Lieutenant Uhura, which was pretty revolutionary as far as Star Trek novels were concerned. So how did you come to write a Star Trek novel?
Well, I grew up on Trek. It was like the answer to my dreams, because I've loved science fiction from the moment I could read. My dad taught me to read before I went to school, and he read science fiction novels to me as bedtime stories. So I had this sort of love. And then suddenly I'm a kid and there's a spaceship on my television, and I was like, oh my God, this is the best thing ever. So years go by and, Trek dies and is resurrected, or will be resurrected. But, the fandom was keeping it alive.
Right.
And I was a deeply unhappy lawyer. I wanted to get out of that. And my friends at the time were all novelists. And I started going to science fiction conventions. And at one of them, I met David Hartwell, who was the editor of that particular Star Trek line of books. And I had started writing my Circuit trilogy, but I wasn't known. And I kind of couldn't get any attention as a science fiction writer. And David and I had a breakfast together, and he said, I'm doing these Star Trek things, and if you could get one novel published that's a science fiction, it would probably help up your profile. Send me an outline, because it seemed like you really like Trek, and I'll look at it. So I went home and I sat with my friend Victor Milan, and we kicked around ideas, because Trek had like three distinct. There was the comedic Trek, Trouble with Tribbles,
right.
Piece of the Action. There was sort of the balance of terror, war kind of stuff. And then there was this very humanistic center of Trek that talked about, respect for other life forms. And I loved Uhura because it was a woman getting to do something that when I was a kid, I kept being told I couldn't be an astronaut because I was a girl. So to see a woman on the bridge of a starship was really exciting to me. And also, in addition to my misspent youth, I studied opera in Vienna. I'm a singer. And so the fact that she was a singer really appeal to me. And music has woven this thread through all of my writing, all of my fiction. Most of my characters are musicians, usually singers. And so I wanted to combine music and that humanistic strain of Trek, and that was where the idea came from. So I wrote the outline, and David bought it, and I wrote the book. But then he gave me some advice. He said, "What do you want for your career? Do you want to be a media tie-in writer, or do you want to write your own stories?"
Right.
And he said, I said, "Well, I think I want to do my own stories." He said, "Well, then never write another one. Because if you do more than one, you're going to end up, the publishing world is going to view you as a media tie-in writer, and it'll be very hard for you to break out." So I followed his instructions, and I never did another one.
Well, it's interesting because, now there's this weird, like I interviewed Diane Duane, who also later went on and
Brilliant, and a dear friend.
She's lovely. And she was talking to me about just how low on the totem pole media tie-in writers were considered to be. And it was interesting because in my mind, the novels that she was writing, starting with the Wounded Sky and then reading Tears of the Singers and what everybody was doing, were so good. And in my head canon, I felt that they were canonical, and they were canonical novels to me. And I didn't understand this idea that we weren't going to get any more shows with the original cast during the original series. So novels that were written in that time period seemed to me, why couldn't they be canonical? Like, I didn't make that delineation in my fandom. And the books that were being written were so interesting. Sorry, my computer is doing something weird. But so I considered them to be as valid as anything else. I didn't consider them like media tie-in things. I'm like, oh my God, there's new Star Trek that's being written.
These great stories.
Great stories. I mean, and any one of them could have been adapted into a movie, or, well, maybe not any one of them, but a lot of them could have. Certainly the ones the one you wrote in Diane's work could have been. But you both found yourself writing for Star Trek The Next Generation. You in a much larger capacity than her, but still she participated in a small way in the first season. But one of the interesting things, after you wrote Tears of the Singers, you were involved with something that was my favorite, still is one of my favorite things, I don't know, maybe ever, which was the Mosaic novels that were part of the Wild Cards series that George R.R. Martin edited. Now, at the time, this was a pre-Thrones, pre-Beauty and the Beast George R.R. Martin, and he had written things that I had read, like Fever Dreams, which is this amazing book about, vampires on the Mississippi River, and he had written things like Sand Kings, and I knew a lot of the short stories that he had written, and then he later got his feet wet in television with Beauty and the Beast in a big way, actually. And he had written for the mid-'80s Twilight Zone, but these Mosaic novels that came out were sort of this shared universe that many different authors were participating in that he was editing. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how did the Wild Card series, which, by the way, is still being published today.
In fact, I edited book number 28, which is set in Great Britain. It comes out in May. It's called Three Kings, and I'm very proud of it. Oh, terrific bunch of writers in it. I'm also a writer in it, but also I edited. George and I created Wild Cards together. And I was editing it with him, and then later he added my name as the co-editor with him, because I had been doing this from the beginning.
Right.
But no, it grew out of a role-playing game. So I was in a role-playing group in New Mexico with Victor Milan and Walter John Williams and, a number of people. And George moved to New Mexico, and we were like, oh, new fresh blood. Would you like to come play in our role-playing games? And then for Christmas one year, Vic gave George this game called Superworld, because he knew George was a big comic book fan from childhood. And so George started obsessively running Superworld. And we were playing it like 3 and 4 nights a week, We were all freelance writers. But we were playing till like 2 and 3 in the morning. And then George would spend the night at my house, because at the time I lived in Albuquerque. He was in Santa Fe. He didn't want to drive back at 3 a.m. So he'd spend the night, I'd feed the horses and make breakfast, and he'd come dragging out for coffee, and then one morning he came out and he said, there's got to be a way to make money off this obsession. And he said, what if we turn it into a shared world? And I went, what a great idea. So we spent 3 hours over blueberry pancakes and coffee, sort of fleshing out the sandbox. And George has always hated the multiple origin stories. I'm standing in a toxic waste dump. I get struck by lightning. I get superpowers. And he said, is there some way we can do some cohesive event? And I said, what about an alien virus being field tested on Earth? And so together, and of course, he's from the Bayonne, New Jersey, New York area. It had to be Gotham, it had to be New York. And so we kind of created this whole universe and sandbox. And then George, who had a lot more connections, I was fairly new in the writing biz, went out to friends and said, hey, you want to come play in our sandbox? And that we started it by saying you have to pitch us a character. And then we approved the character. And meanwhile, we had great help from Bob Asprin and Lynn Abbey, who had done Thieves' World. And they were so generous with their experiences, the pitfalls. And they said, whatever you do, don't do what we did, which is the only rule was you can't kill another writer's character. But there were no other limitations. And so they ended up with wars and, people amputating all the limbs off of each other's characters if they got mad at each other. So we took their master agreement and worked together, George and I, and me with my legal background, to sort of craft a master agreement that had carrots and sticks that kept our writers working. It actually was like a television writer's room before we had ever experienced a television writer's room. I mean, and George and I are much better at it now because we have been in TV writers' rooms, and we sort of go, here's the overarching plot, pitch us the episodes, and that's what the stories kind of are, but we're coming up with the arc of the season.
Well, one of the things I thought was amazing about this concept, I mean, now with everybody reading all the shared worlds or alternate histories of Harry Turtledove, what I thought was amazing about the Wild Card series is this event you talked about was at the end of World War II. These aliens, well, there's an alien virus they try to prevent it, and a good alien, Dr. Tachyon, who I have told people, I said, well, he's kind of like Jack Sparrow. He's if Jack Sparrow from the Pirates of the Caribbean movies was an alien, kind of an alien dandy who wanted to protect humanity, but he gets here and a World War II fighter ace almost stops the alien virus from being detonated on the Earth, but not quite. And then, of course, this event happens, and so people know, this virus is detonated over New York City, and most people are unaffected, but there's people that are affected, and they're broken into two groups of people that were beneficially affected and people that were adversely affected. And the beneficiaries of this disease or virus were called aces, and then the villains were jokers.
Well, they weren't even villains. They were just people who were twisted and deformed by the virus.
Yes.
I mean, George and I wanted to, and most of the people who got the virus died. We wanted this to be fairly realistic. So yeah, and it was one of the things that we did. It was a way to talk about, to talk about class issues and racism and all of those things, which is what science fiction does so well, because it enables people to explore things that are uncomfortable in ways that is a little bit arm's length. So you can kind of go, I wonder if my attitude toward my African-American neighbor is kind of like how these people, it's a safe way to explore these issues without sort of grinding it in somebody's face. And so that's what we always loved about Wild Cards, is it could be very socially relevant.
Well, it was also, one of the things I loved about that first book was you really did take us up from, there's 30 years of history because it started out in the late 80s, but, you did cool things like Jim Morrison really was the Lizard King. And when he would get on stage, he would transform and, hypnotize the audience and literally perhaps maybe become a lizard.
And Fidel Castro was a kid pitching coach for the Dodgers.
It was amazing. And it really was this shared universe in book form. And while it was sort of redolent of other superhero universes. It was completely its own thing, and it combined heady science fiction concepts with comic book tropes and social commentary into this frothy mix of awesomeness that I couldn't get enough of. And I was surprised that it wasn't immediately gobbled up. I mean, I guess at the time Tim Burton's Batman hadn't come out yet, and the 90s certainly we got The Crow, which was really good, but there was nothing else. I mean, it wasn't until 2000's Bryan Singer's first X-Men where the idea of what superheroes could be started to change, and it seems like now the world, it'd be great to have the characters that you guys created. It was amazing. And then soon after this first book came out, Star Trek The Next Generation debuted. And you, of course, were brought on as the story editor and writer for seasons 2 and 3, and you wrote what Mike and Denise Akuta would say is the best episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, The Measure of a Man. Obviously, that was going to be part of a data triptych you'd thought about, but didn't get fully realized.
The third one. Got to do 2 of them, but I didn't get to do the third one.
How did you find yourself working on Star Trek The Next Generation? I mean, you went from novelist to editor to now television producer, story editor?
Well, it's, pardon me a moment. It's George again. George had gone off to Hollywood to work first on the new Twilight Zone and then on Beauty and the Beast. And he called me one day. I was still home in New Mexico, and my phone rings. It's George, and he says, "Hey, Snod." He calls me Snod. And he said, "I think you'd be pretty good at this screenwriting thing because you're fascinated with dialogue. That's what you like to write. You're really into that outlining, plotting thing. And, that's a big deal out here. And if you write a spec script, I'll show it to my agent." And I looked around and I thought, well, LA law looks like it's too intricately plotted, even though I've got the legal background. And I didn't want to write Beauty and the Beast because I thought that was very unfair to George. If I was really bad at this, it was embarrassing for him. He would have to tell me it sucked. Or if he went ahead and showed it to his boss would go, "Why are you showing me this bad script?" So, and I love Trek. So I started watching Next Generation. I fell in love with Data. And then I drew from the legal education, and I said, I can use the the infamous Dred Scott decision as a foundation for this story. But George had given me this whole lecture because at the time, well, you know what it was like. You'd write a spec script, but it was never, you never sold it. It was just a calling card. It was supposed to get your foot in the door so you could then go pitch other ideas. I mean, that's how it worked in that era. And George warned me that I would never, ever, ever, ever sell my spec script. And so I called him back and I said, "Look, I've got this idea and I think it's really pretty good. And I don't want to waste it if it's not going to sell. And maybe I should hold that one for my pitch and write something else." And George gave me the best advice I've ever gotten as a writer. He said to me, "Never hoard your silver bullet." Meaning always lead with the very best thing you've got, whether it's for a novel or, your pitch to go to work for a company, whatever it is, make it the best thing you've got.
Right.
And so I wrote The Measure of a Man. And they not only bought it, they then hired me on the show. And that's, lightning struck me like 3 times. Fortunately, I wasn't in a toxic waste dump when it happened, or maybe unfortunately because I didn't get superpowers. But that's how it happened, and it's part and parcel of the writing business. We pay it forward. People really do, And George gave me that opportunity, and I ran with it.
Well, one of the things too, the second season of Next Generation was a little tumultuous. There was the writer's strike in 1988. So you were jumping into your television writing career in the midst of turmoil. And I kind of wanted to touch on the fact because I want to come back to this. But did you join the WGA then?
Oh, immediately. Yeah. In some ways, my script had gone in. George's agent had received it, liked it, sent it to Trek, and then the strike hit. And it was a 6-month strike, as I recall.
Yeah.
Well, I forgot about it. I went back to writing my novels and riding my horses and living my life, and I thought, well, that was fun. I'm glad I did that. And then I get this phone call from George's agent saying, the producers on Trek want to meet with you. And so I flew out. But then once they bought the script, the first thing I did was join the WGA, which I'm a huge advocate for the protections, because having been a novelist, you're out in the cold, without any kind of support. And the WGA is, it's there for us. It has the legal, and we have contract negotiations and so on and so on.
Well, also one of the things I find interesting about what you're saying is that with the Wild Card series, you had agreements amongst your authors that nobody was going to kill anyone else's characters. So,
without their permission. We give them extra points that translate into money if they let us kill a character.
Right.
So we use the carrot.
and this is going to play into something we're going to touch on a little later. But one of the interesting things about what you brought you got to see the season 2, the crazy tumult of season 2, and season 3 was also, according to Ira Bear, just as tumultuous, but it was different because Michael Piller had been brought on the show and he was sort of changing the direction of things. But I want to talk about when I met you back in 2012 when I was working with Roger Lay Jr. on the special features for Star Trek The Next Generation. And one of the things that we found out, because Mike and Denise Akuta told us, that you had been sent, obviously, this famous VHS video cassette of the editor's cut of Measure of a Man that was almost 15 minutes longer than what aired because it was a talky episode. Right. So there was thought that, we'll get the videotape from you and we'll put the videotape on the disc. And I wonder if you still have it. So I guess Mike and Denise contacted you, and it turns out, why, yes, you did. Yeah. And then from my perspective, what happened with me, I was always like, yeah, but it's going to look bad. So Roger and I were in New York interviewing Patrick Stewart for the documentaries, and we were actually in Ken Ross's office in New York City, who was in charge of this whole project. Right. And I said, dude, we've got access to the negative. They're transferring the negative. Why not get that videotape and have the negative scanned in and rebuild that
what the director did. Yeah,
what the director did, rebuild the extended cut. And there's never been an extended Star Trek episode. I'll never forget, Ken Ross is like, because he was kind of like the Tony Soprano of network executives. He's this big blustery guy. He'd worked in home entertainment. He was magnetic video in the late 70s, early 80s. He worked for 20th Century Fox. I mean, he knew his stuff, and he's like, that's a great idea. That's a good idea, boys. Can we do that? And the question was there going to be effects? There was actually 3 effect shots that they had to do, and Mike and Denise oversaw all of that. And then I got to interview you for the documentaries, and then lo and behold, Measure of a Man was picked to be the Fathom event along with Q Who. So this extended version of Star Trek that you'd written 25 years previous has now been recreated as an extended version, and we all went to a movie theater and saw.
It was so much fun, yeah.
What was that like for you, seeing something that you had written, in 1988 and aired, and now in 2012 it gets recreated in 2K, which it had never been in 2K before, and then they made a movie poster. There's a one sheet that was made, and we all traipse off to Century City to see this episode. What was that like for you to see your work resurrected in a form that it had never been in before, and then shown in a packed movie theater to an audience?
It was, I couldn't breathe, partly because in some ways you always wonder, does it stand up? Because you don't look back, we're like sharks when we're creators, we have to keep moving forward, we die. And so in some ways I had never really watched it again. That was that, and I was doing other things. Yeah. And I thought, oh my God. And that was my first script. And yes, as I look at it, there are things I would do differently. I would get rid of a lot of the come in, all that nonsense that you learn not to do when you're more experienced. And I thought, oh my God, this is happening. I'm with my friends, but will it be good? And then when I realized that some people in the audience were crying in the audience, I was like, guess it works. It still works. And so it was an amazing evening, and I treasure it. And, You actually helped get me the poster that I have framed. It's in my LA home, my office in the LA place, not in my Santa Fe. It was here in New Mexico, but I took it with me when I went to work, oddly enough, on getting wild cards, working to get wild cards set up in television. So yeah, thank you for that.
Oh, well, it was just such a thrill. That episode, when people show clips of Star Trek The Next Generation, that exchange, the Picard, we looking for new life. Well, there it sits.
Yeah.
It's one of the great, and his performance, I don't think Patrick Stewart has ever been better as Picard than that whole exchange. And it's funny to me because you look back at that episode, and as far as, you might say, okay, people coming and going, essentially it's a bottle episode.
Oh, it's a complete bottle show. Yeah.
It's a bottle show. Yes, they redress sets, and yes, we go into a star base, but it really is a bottle show, and it shows that you don't have to have huge action. And Star Trek has never been about that. It's always been about it's always been about the conflict between the mind and the heart, and rationality and reason and illogic and all of those crazy things that happen. And it's such a wonderful piece of not only television writing, but Star Trek. And it was so great to see it on the big screen and in gloriously remastered in the way we'd never seen it before.
And I have to give Jonathan a shout out. I thought Jonathan just did a terrific job as Riker. And we were able to have some conflict between the two men instead of all of this, well, we all love each other so much,
Yeah.
There was this nice moment where Riker wants to win. He wants to prove that he's Picard's, and he is damn near Picard's equal. It's just Whoopi helped Picard, or Guinan helped Picard find the right key, because he was on his way to losing that case. Riker had done a great job, and that was really exciting, because that was always what I loved about original Trek, is that endless debate between Kirk and Spock and McCoy, the mind, the heart, and the brain, the soul, all talking and pulling and tugging at each other. And that's, to me, the heart of Star Trek.
Well, no, absolutely. And what's amazing is that episode holds up so well. And it was so great. Like, there's that great scene where Picard and Riker are fencing that was cut out of the original episode. It was so great to see that. And basically, Picard telling Riker, you have to work just as hard. Even though he's your shipmate, this has to be legit. This has to be a legit thing. And it's just a wonderful moment in Star Trek history. So you did that, and then you began a television career. And as I said earlier, you jumped on to different shows and, worked all the way up throughout the 90s and the aughts. And where are you? Well, what did you learn? What do you think are important lessons as a writer that you learned working in Hollywood, and now still are working in Hollywood? What are things that maybe budding writers could stand to understand before they jump into the deep end of the entertainment business?
That go into it with the understanding that it's collaborative. That if you're the kind of writer who can't stand to have your work touched, don't go to Hollywood, be a novelist. Editors will be very respectful, and they will make suggestions. You go to Hollywood, it's a whole other thing. You turn that script in, and then there's a whole lot of other people who are going to weigh in on it. The director, the studio saying, no, we can't afford that. What are you doing? We can't shoot this scene. What are you talking? And you're going to get rewritten. Your script is going to be taken away and given to other people. And you have to be okay with that. And, the trade-off is you have complete control as a novelist and very small money. And in Hollywood, you have no control, and they give you wheelbarrow loads of money. So you have to decide what it is. And, if you really want to have a lot of control, become a writer-director, sir, which you can advise on. The other thing I would say is, I'm a huge proponent of outlining, or as we say, breaking a story.
Right.
And I was always good at that, but I became really good at it under the tutelage of people like Ira Bear and Rick Manning. They really taught me how to take a story and lay it out. And, does this work? And are we losing track of characters? And And in fact, I have a whiteboard here in my New Mexico office for this novel that I'm working on. That I'm laying it out in terms of acts and scenes, just like I was taught in the writers' room. Now, not in the kind of detail I would do for a script, but nonetheless, it's there. So that was hugely important to me. And I think for writers who are working to deadline, I think it's much harder to be a pantser, as they call it. George calls it being a gardener. And he calls me an architect. So you're an architect, I'm a gardener. I have this seed. I don't know if it's a kumquat or a stinkweed. I have to plant it and see what happens. And I'm going, I'd like to know that before I've written 200 pages. So it's just a different style. I think working in Hollywood made me a better novelist because you begin to know what matters and what's important, and also how to make things very immediate. A lot of novels I end up putting aside because there's too much internal dialogue. It's like, give me the people. I want two people talking. And somebody said dialogue is conflict, and I think and to me, that's exciting. That's what I love to write. So,
well, and that's something that I guess was instilled in me from a very young age. Star Trek, the original series, I loved the speeches. I love this when the characters would have these conversations. Like I remember in A Private Little War when McCoy is yelling at Kirk, "You're condemning these people to decades of conflict," and it was so I loved all that. But they loved each other at the end of the episode, but they could still have
could debate.
They could debate and have those kinds of conflicts. And it's been sort of interesting. Like Star Trek has been something that throughout now that I'm a middle-aged man with one foot in the grave, I like to say, kidding, but
yeah,
Star Trek has lived and grown and breathed and evolved my entire life. And it's sort of interesting since 2009, I feel that it no longer speaks to me or anyone else, but that's there are people that are coming to Star Trek now for the first time, and I never want to take away their enjoyment of something they found, because I've had Star Trek the way I wanted it for 40 years, and now for the last 11 years it's not been the way I would have wanted it, but other people are discovering, and there's so much of the franchise to look back on. But I was curious about, obviously you've been in fan circles and you've been part of fandom as well as being a professional. Like you said, you played role-playing games and you dreamt about being on the Enterprise when you saw Uhura there when you were a little girl. How do you feel about, like on my show, I say that we're all part of what I call the Post-Geek Singularity. We're all imagination connoisseurs, my little catchphrases. Because now all of this stuff, whether it's comic books, whether it's Star Trek or Star Wars, science fiction used to be this niche thing. Superhero comic collecting used to be a niche thing. Now it's completely mainstream. And if you're not going to see Avengers Endgame, it's like, what? Now the people who aren't into these things, it's like completely reversed. How do you feel about fan communities now? And has it surprised you how science fiction, fantasy, and horror and has gone so mainstream, and the fact that Harry Potter got kids into reading in a way that they maybe had never done? I had never seen kids certainly line up at a bookstore to get books. I did. Yeah, I would pre-order my science fiction and horror novels and ride my bike down to Island Books where I grew up and buy things. But seeing, it's unbelievable. And the Lord of the Rings trilogy coming out in grand fashion, and seeing where we're at in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's unbelievable. Now, how do you feel about fan communities now and what has happened? Has it surprised you what's happened in terms of fandom and in terms of how all of this has gone mainstream?
It did surprise me. And there was this sort of comfort in we were all taking comfort in each other, you know what I mean? Because we always felt like we were looked down on in high school, and people were like, "Oh yeah, those people? No, you don't want to sit with them." And I was one of those people. I belonged to the chess club in high school. Okay, that's how much of a nerd I was, and I loved it and loved science fiction. And so we had this sort of chip on our shoulder attitude. And I think one of the things that we have to try to do, I do feel like there's a subset of fandom that's being a little overly protective. I mean, when I'm on panels and people are saying, well, they ruined this and they ruined that, and I'm going, look, we won, okay? Take the win.
Right.
I play video games too. And, two of my favorites are Dragon Age and the Mass Effect. I mean, and I'm playing Witcher 3 right now and Pillars of Eternity. And we won. So, be gracious. There are new people coming in. Let's all be welcoming, because that's why I fell in love with this community, is that we were so open and accepting, and we found each other. And even though these other people may not have been born in the, of the body, as we would say in old Trek, they're coming into our things that we've loved, and we should welcome them. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, one of the things I always am like, especially in the literary fandom a little bit more, it's like, don't be upset if the kids haven't read Heinlein, okay? They're reading new stuff. Maybe we should read the new stuff too, and then we can all have a dialogue. So that's the thing, is that I think we have to be really sensitive and open to each other, and rejoice in the fact that the thing that we've loved our entire lives, that we have this cornucopia of choices. I mean, it's so fantastic. I mean, I can flip on Netflix and my streaming service and go, oh, look, here's Westworld, here's Penny Dreadful here. I mean, it's like,
it's unbelievable.
It's unbelievable. And for people like us, it's like, oh boy, now I can get some of my things out there, I'm going to pitch this idea.
Well, one thing, I wasn't going to touch on this, but since you're here, I'm going to ask you, I don't know if you followed a couple of years back, there was the Hugo Awards controversy.
Oh, yeah.
And there was the group with the sad and the rabid puppies. And, these people that it seemed to me, I found that when I was growing up reading, like I joined the science fiction book club when I was in the 4th grade, when I was 10 years old, and I couldn't get enough. And reading science fiction really broadened my horizons. I mean, about alternative Ursula K. Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness, when you're gender issues and different ways to love one another and alien life forms. And I feel that to be a fan of science fiction and also fantasy and horror, the entire, I just call it the genre, but genre literature is I thought, to be inherently open-minded. And now I wouldn't consider myself a social justice warrior, but I believe in social justice because that's what science fiction, Star Trek,
always been about.
Taught me from a very young age. The diversity of IDIC, infinite. I know IDIC was created to sell through Lincoln Enterprises, but the idea of infinite diversity and infinite combinations was something that was instilled in me when I was 6, 7, 8 years old. And I grew up in a house where my parents never had a bad word to say about anybody. My parents were always like, "Wow, that's just an interesting person." Like I never heard a bad word. And when that happened, for the people who don't understand, there was a group of, I don't know what you'd call them, traditionalists, maybe, conservatives, that were not down with the new and diverse voices that had entered into the science fiction writing community. People of color, people that might be gender fluid. There was all kinds of different people. And my whole thing on this show is I end every show by saying, every person you meet has a story to tell you have yet to hear. And all you have to do is listen. And I believe that. I mean, I say that. But it was really disconcerting to me to see this happening in the science fiction community. And I know the science fiction community has always been prickly about one thing or another. I mean, I remember as a media fan, I would go to Worldcon and they're like, "Oh, you just watch movies, you don't read the books." And I'm like, "Come on, man, I read books, but I like movies too. Like, why can't we all just get along?" What was sort of what is your take on that and how we now have fan communities because of social media so divided these days? People are, I mean, and I'm, when it comes to Star Trek, I'm guilty of bitching and moaning and being a little bit of a gatekeeper myself. Like, get off my lawn! I don't know what you're talking about. But how do you feel about that? And or do you have any thoughts about it?
Well, I mean, it was deeply uncomfortable, and in some ways, it should have told us what was coming in 2016. I mean, that there was this sense of the loss of privilege on the part of certain people, and it was unfortunate because that wasn't my worldcon. That wasn't my experience of fandom. My experience of fandom was welcoming, and so these people saying, "But this is not science fiction." Well, what science fiction is whatever someone can imagine. I mean, let's open it up and let it breathe. If you keep something too tightly, it's going to die. Some of this, I mean, I love social media on one level, and especially in this time when we're all social distancing and we're alone, I can reach out to all these people on Twitter and Facebook, and we can have conversations and we have fun together. And I'm very particular about how everybody behaves. I'm kind of like mom, behave. But it's hopeful. But there is this anonymity that allows for this ugliness. And I don't know how we deal with that. And I think it has added to this division that we see. I'm a Republican, you're a Democrat. We can never talk. And I love Star Wars and I love Star Trek, and never shall the twain meet. I love them both.
Me too.
I'm a huge Star Wars fan. I would give anything to write. I had the Star Wars novel I desperately want to write. My agent's trying to get that set up. Is it a function of how social media operates? Is it the lack of gatekeepers from the people who run Twitter and Facebook? I don't know. And I don't know, I don't know how we handle it. And I'm very worried about it because I'm afraid it's tearing apart the fabric of society. And we're never going to get to that sort of united federation of planets or even a united Earth.
Yeah.
This is how we're playing. And, I know it's sort of, one of the things I keep putting out on Twitter and putting up on Facebook occasionally is, my golden rule is Thumper's mom. If you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. Now, that doesn't mean you can't analyze something. I mean, I did some of the, with Picard, I was asked to do some of the analysis. And, I was like, oh, I wish I'd known, why didn't they give me more about the Romulan pirate? Why didn't they tie the Romulan pirate into Rios having them have to pay a bribe to get Picard down the butt? I wanted more, connection, but that wasn't meant to be ugly. It wasn't, you suck. It's
right.
Like, here was a missed opportunity that I would like to, maybe in the second season, we can see more of, that thing, or here are suggestions. I mean, there's a way to disagree without, I know it's trite, but to disagree without being disagreeable. I just think, try to step back and honor what Star Trek meant to us instead of being, quite so ugly about everything. It's bad. I mean, it does seem to have died down. Dragon Con has given, sort of the traditionalists a place for them to have their very own award, except that, sometimes the social justice warriors slip in and win there too. So, because quality, as one producer said to me, quality will out. It always rises to the top.
I've always believed that. I mean, it doesn't matter, what you're spending. It always comes down to, and one of the things about Star Trek is it proves that. If you think about Measure of a Man being the penultimate episode of the first season of Deep Space Nine, which is called Duet, which is Kira is going head to head with a Gull that they have imprisoned, a Cardassian, and it's just them talking pretty much, and it's riveting, and you don't need lots of money, but great stories and great characters. I always say my Burnett axiom used to be never put your universe before your characters and stories, because your universe will sprout around the characters and stories. But I've changed that as well. There's different. And one of them is, don't put your agenda before your characters or your stories. That whatever your agenda is, it should be baked into the story that you're telling and the characters that right. You don't have to start that way. You're like, I'm going to impart this lesson to the audience. And I'm like, that's, no. That's not how you're not going to write something good there. But now that brings me to something that you and I have sort of been going back and forth about. In Picard, this new season of Picard, a lot of it sprang forth from your episode, Measure of a Man. I mean, the entire series harked back. The 10 episodes of the first season of Picard was all about synths. Where they got synths, I don't know. We had androids, but synthetic life became the central focus of Picard. And the character that you created, Bruce Maddox, back in the second season of Next Generation, became a MacGuffin, and then a character we saw, and then a character that Renee Echevarria created in season 5, Hugh, a Borg that was removed from the collective, also was a character played by Jonathan Del Arco, and he came back to play his character. I do not understand why they didn't hire Brian Brophy to come back and play Bruce Maddox. Yeah, and then 7 of 9 that was created in Scorpion Part 2, which is the 4th season opener of Voyager. They created the Jerry Ryan character. It was Brandon Braga and Joe Menosky. She was also brought back in Star Trek Picard. And what I found interesting was in Star Trek Picard, whenever they would tease the Next Generation theme, or they teased a little bit of a Voyager theme that was worked into the episode, they credited the composers, Jerry Goldsmith, and I think it was Jay Chataway. They were credited in the end credits of the episode. Who wasn't credited was the authors that created these characters that they were using in Picard. And not only were they credited, of the 3 characters that they brought back from Next Generation, they killed 2 of them. They killed Bruce Maddox and they killed Hugh. And they apparently, nobody reached out to you, nobody talked to you. And I looked into this. I looked, of course, into the WGA rules, and the WGA rules talk about character payments. And to round them up, if a character is used, there's a character payment of $600. Yeah. And then if the character is used as the focus of a new series, there could be more. Like if they make a direct-to-video sequel or something, you could get up to $12,000. But then the language, it's if the character is the focus or a focus. The difference is the or a in terms of whether a writer is going to get a character payment or not, which seems a little strange. They'll credit a composer for just teasing a theme for a second or two. They get a credit at the end of the episode. But if you get your character used, you apparently get nothing, no acknowledgement. And unlike what you agreed to when you were doing your Wild Cards novels with all the other authors, they can now murder your character. They can kill your character, so there's no chance your character could ever be brought back. Even when they make a character the focus of the first 4 or 5 episodes of the show, they show your character and they just straight up murder him. And not only that, he's now making deals with a criminal empire to finance his illegal synth operations, like whatever. They take a character that was a wonderful character that was later referenced. I mean, Bruce Maddox is taught a lesson in Measure of a Man. By the end, he's not calling Data it. There's that great scene when he just walks into Data's quarters and starts talking, and Data's like, isn't it customary to like knock before you just come in someone's door? So you created this character that went through an arc and changed, now becomes the focus of Picard. Indeed, your entire episode became the focus of, obviously, that whole storyline grew out of the Measure of a Man, and yet there was no acknowledgement. Nobody called you. Nobody said anything, and you weren't even acknowledged as creating the character. Even the Marvel Cinematic Universe, in the end credits of all the Marvel movies, there is a long list of all the writers and artists that worked on that particular character. In fact, Jim Starlin, who created Thanos, wrote and drew Thanos, is actually in Avengers Endgame, playing a former veteran who's in the Encounter Group session that Steve Rogers is running 5 years after Thanos' snap. But nobody called you. Nobody. And by the way, I reached out to Brandon Braga. I said, did anyone call you about 7 of 9? You or Joe Menosky? And he's actually checking with his business manager to get back to me. But as of now, he got back to me and said, I never thought about that. I didn't even know. And I don't know what Renee Echevarria, everyone's gone on to have careers and everything. But still, it's at least the principle of the thing. And you'd think that the WGA would want to protect their writers. And I mean, look, I've got no dog in this hunt. I just found it to be illuminating in terms of how we're going to do business. Like how with the WGA about ready to go on strike again, they want more residuals. They want to fight for the rights of their creators. I would think that they would, if a writer, I mean, apparently they gave away these rights back in 2008 or something. I mean, I don't quite know. I haven't delved into it enough, but I know I've been going back and forth with you about it because I found it to be sort of annoying. And you would think that these writers, I mean, you're still working, you're developing TV or you're working on shows. They could have reached out to you, and dare I say, they could have used you. They could have really used your expertise and your writing ability. Michael Chabon did the best job he could, but I'm sorry, I'm rambling now.
No, it's okay. No, obviously it surprised me. I did not know any of this was happening. I don't watch Trek. I haven't watched Trek. As my friend Rick Manning said, Star Trek put the S and the T in PTSD for a lot of us. So, I had not. But when I suddenly started getting all of these messages from my fans, did you know Picard is based off of your entire Measure of a Man script? I went, really? I did not know. It would have been nice if they, and yes, I would cheerfully have, enjoyed being interviewed. I'm still available. I'm a working writer. I'm here. Once we can all go back to work again, I would be happy to sit down with them if they were so inclined. I would love to write for this. I mean, there's a lot about the show I like tremendously, and could it be better? Of course, because everything can be better. And I would love to be part of a team to try to improve it and make it even more Trek and fantastic. This again. I had assumed I would get a character payment because back when I was working on Reasonable Doubts, I created a character who became a love interest for Marlee Maitland, who was our star, one of our stars, along with Mark Harmon. And, I got, and he appeared in about 7 or 8 episodes because we wanted, he had a secret, but we wanted to set him up. And so we set him up early, and a lot of other writers on the staff would use him. And every time he got used, I got a check, and yes, it wasn't much money, but it was an acknowledgement, and It was nice. And I was startled to discover that the language has been changed into such a way that and he was very much a secondary character. He was a boyfriend. I mean, he wasn't a major star in Reasonable Doubts, but I still got the money. I'm fortunate. I don't need that $635 or whatever it is. I'm okay. But when you look at however many members, how many members do we have in the Writers Guild? 6,000, 10,000 people. Across that entire group, there's a lot of people who created characters that might come back and be used. That could be a significant amount of money. So I am curious as to what the reason was behind limiting character payments in such a tremendous, very tight way. Is it a huge amount per writer? No. Across a lot of thousands of writers, then it is somewhat significant. So, was the trade-off worth it? I don't know, because I have not talked to the contracts division yet. I mean, I did talk, I was curious. I talked to the legal department, because I'm always interested in legal stuff still. Sure. And they said, it is odd that we would give away a right. One rarely does that. So we'll see what happens. I'm curious though, and we'll see what they come back with on it.
Well, I think we now live in a world where a lot of these franchises are being resurrected, and we have all different writers are coming back. And I mean, I look at people like, I always talk about Ryan Coogler, who wrote and directed the movie Creed, which is part of the Rocky franchise. And Ryan Coogler wanted to make a Rocky film and went to Sylvester Stallone and pitched him on this idea because he was a huge Rocky fan and he had made a great indie film in Fruitville Station. And Sylvester Stallone, after cajoling and needing to be convinced, went ahead and they made Creed, which I think is a wonderful example of how to make a sequel to a long-running franchise involve your main character, to the point where Sylvester Stallone got an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor in Creed. And I'm like, that's how you want to resurrect franchises. In all of this, where IP has become important, to find really talented people who are really passionate about this franchise. And it was maddening when Star Trek '09 came out, and I would listen to J.J. Abrams in every interview say, I was never a Star Trek fan. You know, I'm like, you know, yet he's directing the biggest movie that Star Trek has ever seen up to that point. And it's frustrating to watch a 10-part show that literally is a sequel to your episode. I mean, dealing with synthetics and androids, the rights of androids. This was legal precedent that had been set in The Measure of a Man in the Star Trek universe that apparently was somehow thrown out. So they're not. When did this happen? And I really felt it didn't do a very good job delving into. I mean, obviously we've seen Battlestar Galactica, and we've seen Ex Machina, and we've seen now Westworld. There's all of the Blade Runner, this idea of synthetic people. If we can create life, or whether it's intelligent life and post-singularity life and all of this, what are the ramifications and the rights? Fascinating questions, ethical questions that we as a people have yet to address here in the real world. And yet I felt like you had this great thoughtful episode of Star Trek that's a seminal episode of Next Generation, and they breezed right by that, and really, in a way, I felt your episode was not well served by the 10 episodes of Picard that has followed. Whereas there are Star Trek novels, I need to point out, like David Mack wrote a trilogy about the Sung androids that are amazing. And it's an amazing trilogy of that deals with all of them, that I feel like all of the writers of Picard should have read before they watched your episode, but they could have done well to write or read those books. But be that as it may, I mean, I do think that it's important amongst the writing community for writers to look out for one another. And I know Hollywood is the last place in the world you would expect that. But especially when you have a continuum like Star Trek that has lived and grown for now, we're almost 5.5 decades into the franchise. If you work in this franchise, I think you have an obligation to acknowledge who and what have come before. And the last, with Discovery, they have just, and Picard, they are strip mining classic Star Trek and the previous shows, and I don't necessarily think always for the best. And I guess my question to you is, well, how do you feel about that?
Well, look, I mean, here's the problem. We go into this knowing that we don't own this. I mean, you know, this is CBS or Paramount or Warner Brothers or whoever has that franchise. And you know, was I disappointed that they killed Bruce in order to put more stress on whatever, I blanked on her name. Anyway, Blondie. You know, powerful in terms of what they want to do with that character. I understand. I don't own that character, and they can do as they please with the character. And with all that work that we did, I mean, that's the trade-off. It's the wheelbarrow loads of money versus very small amount of money for writing a novel.
Sure.
You know, I do think when you have something like a Star Trek or a Star Wars that has this history and this precedent, it's nice to see. I mean, you know, when I wrote Measure, in many ways, I feel like I was standing on the shoulders of people like Dorothy Fontana and Gene Kuhn. You know, I mean, Dorothy, who wrote such beautiful, beautiful episodes for the original series. And I wanted to try to honor what they had done and the kind of stories they told in my small way, you know, to say I'm tipping my hat to those people. And I think that there is a kindness to that, you know, and all of us are in a conversation with each other. And it's nice to be acknowledged. And especially, I think it's unfortunately, occasionally women creators tend to get their creative work is oftentimes, you know, overlooked more than often it is for men. I think that's changing, and that's good. But I think we still have to stand up and say, you know, I'm here. and acknowledge me, acknowledge what we brought to that. And that includes, and Michael wrote a lovely, he wrote a lovely Instagram post about the women of Star Trek who have brought, so much with so much love and so much creation to this franchise. I was so lucky that I got to actually get to know Dorothy, and to say to her, this meant so much to me, the work you did, the stories you told, Journey to Babel, and the Mock Time, and also City on the Edge of Forever, because she did the rewrite. Harlan and I had a bet about that. He asked me to do an afterword for his City on the Edge of Forever book that came out. And he said to me, Gene rewrote that script. And I said, no, he didn't. I said, Dorothy rewrote it. I will bet you money that Dorothy rewrote. And then she confessed in her afterward that she, in fact, had done the rewrite. And, it just, you see it, the humanity in City is exuded. And, one of the great, great episodes of Trek. But again, if you get rewritten in Hollywood. Even Harlan Ellison got rewritten.
Oh yeah,
got rewritten by Dorothy Fontana. To create something, a legacy.
Well, I think
it is what it is. It's our business. If we want to play in this sandbox, we play in this sandbox. But we can always try to be a little better, I guess.
Right. Well, I think to sort of wrap up, one of the things that I find really interesting what's going on today is a lot of these beloved franchises. Star Wars, obviously when George Lucas first made it, the first Star Wars, he had a partnership with Fox. They paid for it. But by Empire Strikes Back, Lucas paid for it himself. He organized for his own funding, and Star Wars was really sort of his. And Star Trek, when you were there under the Berman era, it was really controlled. Berman oversaw everything. And of course, he worked with people like you and Jerry Taylor and Michael Piller and Ira Stephen Bear and a lot of other people. But really, Berman presided over it, 25 seasons of Star Trek over 18 years. But nowadays, these franchises like Star Trek is now CBS's and Viacom. They're, I guess, back together, maybe. And then Disney has bought Star Wars and Marvel. And so the idea that these IPs, these beloved stories that have been so important in terms of merchandising and money making, but the stories themselves are now presided over by corporate interests. And I'm not necessarily an anti-globalist, and I like Disney, but I don't think corporate interests they're almost diametrically opposed to telling good stories, because corporations these have to appeal to the greatest amount of people, and we have to make them the most sort of milquetoast for the masses, and that is not conducive to the kind of storytelling that made these IPs popular in the first place. Right. And now you can't have corporate interests second guessing or saying we need to make stories like this, because spreadsheet storytelling is never going to work. So now that these very lucrative IPs that have been purchased by corporations are now being presided over by corporations, but the very thing they wanted in buying these things in the first place is sort of torpedoed by the fact that corporations are now telling creators what kind of things they need to write and create. So my question to you is, in this environment, is it still possible for these beloved IPs that have now existed? Star Trek is 54 years old. Star Wars is 43 years old this year. Is it possible for corporations to be able to be the custodians of these franchises, yet still allow creators to make great stories, to tell great stories under their umbrella? Can that be done?
I think it can. I think, spreadsheets do one thing for people. They do tell you if you over control something. Look at the difference between the Rise of Skywalker, whatever the last one was, versus the Mandalorian. Which one is getting the praise? Which one is getting the eyes? It's the Mandalorian.
Right.
And I was there on opening night for the Rise of Skywalker. Not happy, but okay. It's my world. It's a world I've loved. So I was there, but I've watched The Mandalorian all the way through 3 times now, because Filoni and Favreau I'm watching, the Clone Wars, and I think if you can sit down with, and I wear two hats. I was a lawyer, I'm a businesswoman, I'm also a creator. If you can do that, if you can go into the corporate overlords and say, look, let the creators breathe the life of what has made these popular, you will make more money. If you try to put this into, a puzzle piece, if we do this, this, and this, it'll be successful. It's not proving to be that. And I think they will wake. I'm hoping they will wake up. I mean, because I'm seeing really incredible creation happening by people who love that franchise versus what's happening when it's paint by numbers. And, I mean, the people who run these studios, they're not stupid,
Right.
I mean, I've never met anybody I've worked with in Hollywood who's stupid. These are bright people who all love art and love creating. It's just that when you're worried that your job is, oh my God, I can get fired if I blow this, it's hard to say, oh my God, and I wish we didn't have to spend $150 million or $200 million on these things. I mean, I love the Avengers franchise. I don't need another giant CGI fight.
Right.
I really don't. I need a scene of Steve Rogers sitting with the survivors, and talking about what it means to have lost your husband. I don't need a big thing at the airport like in Civil War. I don't need it.
Although, though, come on. That was pretty cool. I mean, I've often said, like, I loved Avengers Endgame, but the first half, which I rewatched the other day, is all character development. It's all people talking to each other. I mean, there's that great scene with Natasha and Steve Rogers when he comes back, and she's just sitting at her desk and he's leaning against the door frame and they're having this conversation, and the scene with Tony Stark and Pepper and their daughter, and they spend an hour and a half of that movie, before they get to the crazy. I mean, it still is a comic book movie, and I loved when I first saw the first Avengers movie in 2012, I couldn't even believe I was watching it. I'm like, I can't believe that this movie exists. I couldn't believe it existed. I'm like, this is amazing. Like, and who would have ever thought 20 years ago?
I love the first one, Captain America: The First Avenger.
It's so good.
That movie is a jewel. I mean, it's a jewel, and the relationship with Dr. Erskine, and I mean, I just loved it. I think the reason the Civil War, I mean, yes, it was impressive and there were some fun moments, but there had been so many fight sequences before we got to the damn airport.
Right.
That I was just like, really? Another one? And then, anyway, don't get me ranting about, and then why was Tony and the Cap fighting? I still don't buy it. It was like too many fights, and it undercut the power of what they were trying to do, because it was like, give me more moments, give me more moments of these people and their relationships than this. And that's what Trek did really well, and what Star Wars used to do. I mean, I think Solo is a very underrated movie.
I do too. I mean, I
rewatched it, and there's some great stuff there. I mean, there's a great little caper movie.
Right.
And why a man becomes the cynical person he becomes. I mean, there's just, so I didn't need 80,000 Star Destroyers with planet killers on them.
Yeah, no. Well, that was never, I mean, the funny thing I've always said to people about Star Wars is it's basically about two relatively blue-collar dudes. I mean, Luke's a farmer and Han Solo's a truck driver. He's basically a bootlegger, and that's what he's doing. And he's got his ramshackle 18-wheeler. It's just the Millennium Falcon in space. He's Smokey and the Bandit, and it's these two guys that are just they don't know what's up. And they get pulled into this
much bigger world.
It's much bigger. And you're watching these two Jablonskis try and fumble their way through, like, hey, there's the princess is here. We got to go get her. What? Yeah. Let's go get her.
A reward. There's a reward.
Yeah, I mean, it's and there's an element of that I think now it's all I think with the prequel trilogy, it's all important people. It's all aristocrats and the Jedi and the this and the that, and you're missing. There was obviously, when I saw Star Wars as a kid, I'm like, I loved Han. I wanted to be Han, but I felt like I was Luke. When he comes out and looks at the twin setting suns of Tatooine with the French horn music playing. Every kid was there. If there's a bright center of the universe, I'm at the place that it's furthest from, and I want the adventure. I want my life to begin. And why do I have to do my chores? I'm mowing the lawn or taking the garbage out. This sucks, that was
Galaxy Quest.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It was great, and that was the thing that I think is that's why that movie connects. And that's why I think Empire works as well as it does. And then by the time you get to Jedi, it gets all. But that's neither here nor there. My opinion on.
We'll talk about that another time.
Yeah, another time. But I liked ending on this sort of hopeful note. I mean, like you said, people in Hollywood, they are smart, and I think now, look, being online and being on YouTube and being part of the fan punditry space. In addition, I'm still working professionally myself. And there have been people in the industry that have said, well, I've watched your show. I'm like, you do? And he's like, well, you have or she or he, but it was mostly a he. This one person's talking about how I've created this fan community of positive. That's what I've been selling is positivity, even though I didn't know that I was doing that. Because I'm like, isn't this cool? Look at on my bookshelf here. Look what I got. Wild cards. You got to read this. And people are like, oh, okay.
And action figures.
I mean, all of it. It's my Robservatory, with everything. But we live in this world now. What I do think is wonderful, like you pointed out, whether you're watching The Umbrella Academy or The Boys or Carnival Row or Game of Thrones or Better Call Saul or Breaking Bad or Ozark or a Money Heist or The Kingdom, which is a Korean zombie show. I mean, we are surrounded. We live in a world of imagination riches, the likes of which we've never seen. And there are companies that are publishing, like I just saw this slipcased version of the Foundation trilogy that's beautifully illustrated that comes from some small press. It costs like $600 and you can put it on a monthly payment plan. I'm like, sign me up. I'm going to get the Foundation trilogy. Denis Villeneuve's making a Dune movie. It's just insane the riches that we're getting. And I'm always saying that, my God, even though one thing might be letting you down or something, there's all this other.
It's something fabulous. Yes.
There's more fabulous stuff out there than ever before.
This is the golden age of television.
It is absolutely the golden age of television. It's just this long form storytelling. I can't get enough of it, and everybody's into it. And what I feel is it's really elevating. It's smart TV. TV has gotten much smarter, and it's presupposing a lot of intelligence on the audience's part, which I felt that was the case when I was a kid watching Twilight Zone and Star Trek. I'm like, well, these people think even I as a kid that I'm smart. No one's talking down to me. I hated children's programming that talked down to me. I couldn't abide it, because as a kid I started watching Star Trek and Twilight Zone and Outer Limits first before I went to like Thundar the Barbarian, and I couldn't hang with kids shows. It wasn't. Well, I guess so. I mean, at the end of all of this, where are you at? Where are you at now in your career? What are you up to now? And how are you feeling about where we're at as a culture in terms of where our imaginations are at?
I feel pretty good about, I don't feel very good about the political culture, but in terms of the creative culture, I think we're in a fabulous place. I think that, Amazon, there are books that are never going to go out of print. I mean, you can always read something. There's going to be something to watch. And so I feel pretty good about that. I worry about the state of the world. I worry about climate change. I worry about this pandemic that we're enduring and hoping that people stay safe and social distance, and please don't get sick, people. Take care of yourselves. My career, I'm working on a novel, because right now our business is pretty much shut down for the time being. I do have a TV pilot that a company wants to shoot. And in fact, I have to email them about us getting a lookbook together and maybe shooting a trailer, put together a trailer. So when we can reopen, we can go out with this and say, here, we've got this fabulous thing. And I've, got a Bible for it in episodes. It's actually based on one of my novel series with enormous changes. And George and I are still working on getting Wildcard set up. I was executive producer when we had a writer's room last year, and then unfortunately they didn't move forward with the project. But we're going to try to resell it someplace else, because we have a unique take. I think we offer a view into how politics and how culture would be affected by superheroes in a way that I don't think a lot of other shows and other series have done. So I'm hoping we'll have that opportunity. And, meanwhile, I'm trying to get my own show up and running. And I would love to be in a writer's room again.
Well, yeah, I mean, you should be.
Looking forward to be hired. Yeah.
I find reading stories about how Walter Mosley, one of my favorite novelists, was treated for his brief stint in the Star Trek Discovery writers' room. I feel also there's like a lack of respect for people that have, or there's a fear, like, I don't want to work with somebody that has a lot of experience in the business because they're going to take my place or something, which I think is sort of absurd, because when I was younger and just starting out in the business, people took me under their wing and showed me a lot of stuff. And I'm like, I want to work for these people and learn from them and do a better job. And I want to see more of that. And I think, now, especially, look, I'm no spring chicken. And I know when I walk into a room, I'm older, I'm a white cis male. I got a lot going against me, it's problematic. But I'm still having a good time. Like, there was a horror film I produced 12 years ago that is now coming out on Blu-ray, and I spent the last month here in quarantine creating all of the special features, delving into these tapes I shot in Bulgaria 12 years ago, and now it's all coming back. Like, this film is now coming out again, and Roger Lay Jr., who I did the special features with, he's producing shows for Netflix. And I'm working on this other Netflix show that a friend of mine created, and there's more opportunity now, I think, than ever. And I think ultimately it's getting to the point where if people like what you're creating, it's all going to shake out, because what people need now are great stories and great storytellers. And there's more of that happening now than ever before.
Yep. And when we can finally reopen, a lot of people will have watched everything there is, and we're going to need new content. So we're going to get in there, right?
Well, Melinda Snodgrass, I'm not going to ever call you Snod, although I think that's kind of funny. I love becoming friends with you, and I want to thank you for doing this wonderful interview. And I'm sure I will be calling on you. Hopefully, I'll be calling on you to talk about your new show of your own, and then Wild Cards and whatever else. And it's been a joy to know you, but even a bigger joy to know your work.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for having this conversation. It's so nice in this time of isolation to, reach out and talk to a fellow fan. So.
Well, thanks for giving up your time. I mean, I know you could be working or something, and it's wonderful to have this interview. Now, I will put this interview, a part of it's going to be on the 400th show, and then I'll release the whole thing as a standalone piece, as a podcast, and on YouTube, and I'll, of course, tag you.
Thank you, and I will put it out there to people. So thanks again. I really appreciate it.
This was awesome. Thank you so much. And I will talk with you soon.
Yep, I hope so.
All right, and we didn't even get to talk about how all the best Star Trek people are also equestrians. You and Bill Shatner.
That's right. Bill and I talked about our horses the entire time we had lunch.
Oh yeah, I mean, that's it. Well, keep riding the horses and stay safe and stay healthy.